It should never have existed. A city rising out of a swamp with no roads, no farms, no army, and no reason to survive. Yet for 1,000 years, Venice became the most sophisticated republic in the world. It stole a saint from Egypt to claim divine protection. It hijacked an entire crusade and used it to destroy a rival empire. And when Napoleon finally arrived to end it all, the last Doge simply removed his crown, handed it to a servant, and said, "I shall not need this again." Tonight, we ask how all of that happened. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. Look at it. Water in every direction. No solid ground beneath your feet. No fields to grow wheat. No forests to cut timber. No roads to bring soldiers. Just salt marsh, shallow channels, and a sky so wide and flat it feels like the world forgot to finish itself here. If you were a Roman citizen standing on the edge of this lagoon in the 5th century, you would not have looked at it and seen a future. You would have looked at it and seen the end of everything you had ever known, and you would have been running. The world that created Venice was a world on fire. The great Roman towns of northeastern Italy, places like Aquileia and Altino and Padua, had stood for centuries as monuments to order and civilization. Marble forums, heated bathhouses, roads straight as sword blades cutting across the flat Veneto plain. These were cities where educated men argued philosophy and merchants counted gold. They were, in every sense that mattered, the center of the world. Then the Huns arrived. In the year 452, Attila and his cavalry swept down from the north and sacked Altino, not defeated it, not occupied it, erased it. The smell of burning timber and scorched stone hung over the Vento plain for weeks. Families who had lived in the same house for 5 generations grabbed whatever they could carry and ran toward the only place the horsemen could not follow. The water. The lagoon was not a destination. It was a last resort. These were the people the writer Cassiodorus later called the Incolae Lacunae, the lagoon dwellers. He described them living like seabirds, their homes barely distinguishable from the water around them, fishing from small boats, harvesting salt from the shallows. When he wrote about them, sometime in the early 6th century, there was a note of wonder in his words. Not admiration exactly, more like the quiet surprise of a man watching something survive that had no right to. But the Huns were only the beginning. In 568, the Lombards crossed the Alps. This was the invasion that finished the job. Where Attila had burned and moved on, the Lombards stayed. They occupied the great plain of northern Italy and simply kept it. The old Roman towns that had partially recovered from earlier raids were destroyed again, this time permanently. The region of Venetia, the whole northeastern corner of the Italian peninsula, was carved up and swallowed. What remained of Roman imperial authority was pushed back to a thin strip of coastline, and the lagoon communities clustered along it. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruling from Constantinople, held onto these coastal remnants and called them the Exarchate of Ravenna. But Constantinople was far away and getting farther every year. The lagoon communities were on their own. They just did not know it yet. Now imagine what it actually took to live there. The islands of the lagoon were not islands in any comfortable sense. They were mudflats, barely above the waterline, soft underfoot, the kind of ground that swallows a boot and does not give it back. Building anything permanent on this surface seemed, at first glance, completely impossible. The refugees solved it with wood. They cut timber from the forests of the mainland, long straight trunks of alder and oak and larch. Then they drove those trunks vertically down into the lagoon mud, hundreds of them, thousands of them, packed so tightly together that over time the waterlogged wood hardened into something close to stone. The mud around the piles, deprived of oxygen, preserved the timber rather than rotting it. On top of these compressed forests of buried wood, the settlers laid stone foundations. On top of the stone, they built walls. Think about that for a moment. Venice is not built on water. It is built on trees, invisible trees, submerged beneath centuries of stone and canal water, holding the whole city up from below. The most beautiful city in the world rests on a foundation that no one can see. The early settlers did not know they were building something beautiful. They were building something survivable. There is a difference. Salt was the first economy. The lagoon produced it naturally. And salt in the early medieval world was not a seasoning. It was a technology. The only reliable way to preserve food through winter. The lagoon dwellers harvested it, packed it, and traded it to the mainland communities that needed it desperately. Wood moved in one direction, salt moved the other. A fragile commercial circuit began to turn, and with commerce came something else, something the refugees had not expected to find out here on the water. A reason to stay. The communities spread across multiple islands, each with its own small population, its own local leaders, its own particular relationship to the channels and sandbars of the lagoon. They were not yet a city, not yet even a proper settlement, but they were organized. By around 568, the earliest governing committee of the Lagoon Islands had formed. The Tribuni Maiores, the senior tribunes representing the various island communities, met to coordinate defense and manage shared resources. It was not a government in any grand sense. It was neighbors agreeing not to let everything fall apart. Then came the first Doge. Early in the 8th century, the lagoon communities did something remarkable. They elected a leader. His name was also Ipato. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople confirmed him with the titles Hypatus and Dux, meaning roughly consul and military commander. He was, in the formal historical record, the first Doge of Venice. The word Doge itself comes from the Latin dux, which simply means leader. But the significance of what happened in that election runs much deeper than the title. These were Roman refugees, people who had grown up inside the most hierarchical empire the Western world had ever produced. Emperors were chosen by God, or by armies, or by the accident of blood. Power descended from above. That was the only model anyone living in the 5th or 6th century had ever seen. And yet here, on these mud flats, these scattered fishing communities looked at each other and said, "We will choose, we will vote, we will name the person who leads us." That instinct, born from desperation and isolation, would eventually grow into the most durable republic in human history. 1,000 years of elected leadership. 1,000 years without a king. But in the early 8th century, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was chaos. The early doges ruled from Heraclea, a settlement on the edge of the lagoon. Factions formed immediately. Some families looked toward Constantinople, wanting to remain within the orbit of the Byzantine Empire. Others looked toward the rising Frankish power of the Carolingians and saw a more useful protector. A smaller group simply wanted peace with the Lombards on the mainland. These factions did not debate politely. Also, Ipato's successor, Teodato, was assassinated. The man who seized power after him was also assassinated within a year. The Lagoon was not yet a republic. It was a muddy arena where ambitious men killed each other for control of something that barely existed. What stabilized it, eventually, was geography. The same water that had trapped these people also protected them. In 810, a Frankish king named Pepin, son of Charlemagne, decided that the lagoon communities needed to be brought under Carolingian control. He brought an army. He besieged the settlement at Malamocco, the island on the outer edge of the lagoon that then served as the ducal seat. He expected a quick victory. The lagoon ate his army alive. Pepin's soldiers could not navigate the shallow channels. They could not bring their horses through the marsh. The diseases of the swamp, the fevers that rose off the stagnant water in summer, moved through his ranks faster than any Venetian weapon could. The siege lasted 6 months. Pepin's forces were ravaged. They withdrew. A few months later, Pepin himself died, apparently from an illness contracted in those marshes. The lagoon had not just defended the settlers, it had killed a prince. The Doge at the time, Agnello Partipazio, responded to Pepin's failed attack by doing something that would define Venice for the next 1,000 years. He moved the ducal seat, not back to the mainland, deeper into the water. He relocated the center of government to the islands of the Rivo Alto group, the cluster of islands that would become the heart of the city. In Latin, Rivo Alto meant high bank. In the mouths of the people who lived there, that name compressed over generations into a single word, Rialto. This was not just an administrative decision. It was a declaration. The Venetians were not going back to the mainland. They were not going to become part of any empire, Frankish or otherwise. They were going to build something here, in this impossible place, on these buried trees, in this salt water, and it was going to be theirs. Agnello began the work immediately. Bridges, canals, stone buildings, bulwarks along the water's edge. The islands began to connect. The channels between them became streets. The city that had existed only as a scattering of fishing huts started, for the first time, to look like a city. By the early 9th century, the two great empires of the age, Charlemagne's Frankish realm and the Byzantine Empire of Nicephorus, had reached an agreement. The Pax Nicefori recognized Venice as nominally Byzantine, but practically independent. In exchange, Venetian trading rights along the Adriatic coast were protected. Both empires had decided, in effect, that the lagoon people were more useful as traders than as subjects. Venice had found its first lever, and it would pull levers like this for 1,000 years. Stand on those early islands and feel what the settlers felt. The cold of the Adriatic in November, cutting through whatever rough cloth you wore. The sound of the tide moving through the channels at night, that low rhythmic pull that never stopped, not even for a moment, as though the water itself were breathing. The taste of salt on your lips every waking hour, the constant physical effort of moving everywhere by boat, every errand, every visit, every load of timber or basket of fish, requiring a vessel and the strength to row it. These people were not building a civilization. Not yet. They were surviving. One generation at a time. One tide at a time. But survival has a way of teaching lessons that comfort never could. The lagoon people learned to read water, the way mainland farmers read soil. They learned which channels could carry a loaded boat and which would ground it. They learned the seasonal rhythms of salt production, the timing of the tides, the behavior of the wind off the Adriatic. They developed skills that no invading army could replicate. And because they traded constantly, moving salt to the mainland and bringing back timber and grain, they developed something else. A talent for negotiation, a feel for what other people needed and how much they would pay for it. The 12 founding families of Venice, the so-called apostolic families who had elected that first Doge, traced their lineage back to the Roman towns of Padua and Aquileia and Treviso. They had been wealthy, educated, powerful men in the world that Attila destroyed. On the Lagoon, they became something different. They became merchants. And in becoming merchants, they discovered that commerce, handled carefully, could do what armies could not. Commerce could reach everywhere. Commerce did not need roads. The settlers had survived the first generation on the water. They had learned to fish, to trade salt, to build on nothing. But surviving is not the same as being safe. Because the most powerful empire in the world, Constantinople, still considered this swamp its own property, and it was about to remind Venice exactly who was in charge. What do you do when the most powerful empire on earth claims to own the ground beneath your feet? Except there is no ground, just water, mud, and the memory of something better. Picture a Byzantine emperor on his golden throne in Constantinople, robes of purple silk, walls of mosaic gold catching the lamplight, every gesture rehearsed over centuries of imperial ceremony, now cut to a Venetian fisherman's hut on stilts above the lagoon. Rotting timber, salt crust on every surface, the smell of low tide coming through the gaps in the walls. These two images were supposed to exist in the same political reality. Venice was, on paper, a subject territory of the Eastern Roman Empire. The emperor in Constantinople considered these lagoon people, his property. The legal arrangement had a name, Byzantine suzerainty, and for the men and women who had survived the floods, and the hunger and the impossible labor of building on nothing, that arrangement sat over every decision like a hand pressed flat against the chest. You could breathe, but not freely. Here is what it meant in practice. The early leaders of Venice, the men who held the title of Doge, did not simply take power. They were confirmed by Constantinople. The emperor granted them honorific titles, words in Greek that meant subordinate and grateful. Hypatos, Spatharios, titles that Byzantine officials in distant provinces received as reminders of who was really in charge. The first historically confirmed Doge, also Hypato, carried those titles. They were not decorations, they were a leash. And yet the leash had slack in it, because Constantinople was far away, because the roads between Ravenna and the Lagoon had been swallowed by Lombard territory, because the only connection between the Byzantine outposts of northern Italy ran by sea, and the sea, as the Lagoon people already knew better than anyone alive, belonged to whoever understood it best. Distance is a kind of freedom. The Venetians began to feel that freedom early. But freedom without protection is just exposure, and exposure in the 8th century meant death, because the world around the lagoon was not peaceful. The Lombards held the mainland. The Franks were rising in the west under a king named Pepin the Short, and his son after him would remake the entire political map of Europe. Constantinople still claimed Venice, and Venice, caught between these forces, had to make a choice that no fishing village should ever have to make. Which empire do you belong to, and what do you offer each of them to stay alive? This was the moment the Venetian political instinct was born, not in a council chamber, not in a written law, in the gut of men who understood they were small, that they were surrounded, and that the only path forward was to make themselves impossible to ignore and too useful to destroy. The factions inside Venice reflected the impossible geography of their situation. One group wanted to stay close to Constantinople, to keep the Byzantine connection, to remain part of the empire that had, at least nominally, protected them. Another group looked west, toward the Carolingian Franks, toward the new power that was reshaping Europe. A third group, smaller and more pragmatic, wanted peace with the Lombards next door. These were not abstract political positions. These were survival strategies, argued in low voices in buildings that shook when the wind came off the Adriatic. The crisis came to a head in the early 9th century. A doge named Obelerio degli Antonori made the catastrophic decision to pull Venice fully into the Carolingian orbit. He invited Charlemagne's son Pepin, king of the Lombards, into Venetian affairs. And Pepin came, not as an ally, as a conqueror. Pepin's army descended on the Lagoon in 810. The Venetians, who had been living on the outer islands at Malamocco on the long, thin strip of land between the lagoon and the open sea, fled inward. They abandoned Malamocco. They pulled back into the deeper channels, into the maze of islands at the heart of the lagoon, into the place that would become Venice proper, the place they called Rivo Alto, High Shore. Rialto. Pepin's army stood at the edge of the water and could not follow. His soldiers were not lagoon men. They did not know which channels could carry a boat and which would swallow it. They did not know the tides, the shifting sandbars, the hidden passages that only someone raised on that water could navigate by feel. Pepin camped at the lagoon's edge for 6 months. His men sickened. The swamp air, thick with the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation, did what no army could do. It killed them. Pepin himself withdrew, contracted some illness from the marshes, and died shortly after. The lagoon had defended Venice. The water that had always been a prison turned out to be the most perfect fortress ever built, not by human hands, by geography. But a fortress that defeats one enemy does not guarantee peace. What Venice needed now was legitimacy, recognition, a formal agreement that told both great empires, both Charlemagne's heirs and the emperor in Constantinople, that this small cluster of islands in the northern Adriatic belonged to no one and therefore to itself. That agreement came, the Pax Nisori, named for the Byzantine emperor Nisoris, formalized what the defeat of Pepin had already proven in blood and fever. Charlemagne and Nisoris recognized Venice as Byzantine territory. In exchange, Venice acknowledged Carolingian authority over the Italian mainland. Both empires got what they needed on paper. Venice got something far more valuable. It got to exist between them. The Doge who navigated this settlement was Agnello Participazio, and what he did next showed exactly what kind of mind was now running Venice. He moved the ducal seat from Malamocco to the Rialto Islands. He began building bridges, canals, stone buildings, fortifications. He was not simply moving an administration. He was founding a city. The modern Venice, the one that still stands, began with Agnello Participazio, deciding that the place where his people had fled in desperation was actually the best possible place to build something permanent. His son, Giustiniano, would later bring the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist to Venice from Alexandria. wrapped in a merchant's basket beneath layers of pork and cabbage, smuggled past Muslim customs officials who would not touch the unclean meat. The remains of a saint, stolen and hidden under food that inspectors refused to search. Even their religion, Venice acquired through cunning, through trade, through the particular genius of people who had learned to move things across borders that others thought impossible. But that story belongs to what comes next. First, understand what Venice had become by the early 9th century. It was not Byzantine, not really. The emperor in Constantinople still received formal acknowledgement. The doges still carried honorific titles that gestured toward imperial subordination. But the decisions were made in the lagoon. The trade routes were controlled from the lagoon. The ships were built in the lagoon. And those ships were going places. The Adriatic was Venice's first classroom. The men who had learned to read the lagoon's channels now learned to read the open sea. They moved salt north and south along the coast. They carried timber and grain and the things that cities needed and could not produce themselves. They developed a feel for the rhythms of commerce, for what was scarce in one place and abundant in another, for the gap between those two conditions where profit lived. During the reign of Domenico Monegario, Venice changed from a fishing settlement into a port of trade. Shipbuilding advanced. The pathway toward Venetian dominance of the Adriatic was being laid one keel at a time. The sound of hammers on timber, of caulking mallets driving oakum into seams, became the background noise of a city that was learning what it was for. And what it was for, increasingly, was trade. Not just local trade, not just salt and fish moving up and down the coast. Long-distance trade, the kind that required leaving sight of land, crossing open water, arriving in ports where nobody spoke your language and everyone wanted what you carried. Venice's position between the Carolingian West and the Byzantine East was not just a political problem to be managed. It was a commercial opportunity to be exploited. The Franks needed Eastern goods, Constantinople needed Western goods, and Venice sat exactly between them, with ships and sailors and the particular fearlessness of people who had already survived everything the world had thrown at them. You do not grow up in a lagoon, building on mud, rowing every errand, watching the tide take things and bring things, without developing a certain indifference to difficulty. The Venetians had been formed by their environment into exactly the kind of people that long-distance trade required: adaptable, patient, comfortable with risk, deeply, constitutionally suspicious of anyone who claimed to be their master. They paid tribute when tribute was required. They offered loyalty when loyalty was demanded. And they built their ships and sailed their routes and made their deals regardless. The Byzantine emperor could call them subjects. The Carolingian emperor could call them neighbors. The Venetians called themselves merchants. And in calling themselves that, they had found the identity that would carry them across 1,000 years. The lesson of the 8th and 9th centuries was not subtle. Venice had been claimed by empires it could not fight, so it did not fight them. It made itself useful to both of them. It positioned itself as the one place where East and West could meet, where goods could cross from one world to another without the friction of war or ideology. It became the hinge, and the hinge, as any carpenter knows, is the most important piece in the door. Never fight the powerful directly when you can make yourself indispensable to them instead. That was the lesson. It would take centuries to fully master, but the shape of it was already clear by the time Agnello Participazio laid the first stone foundations in the Rialto mud. Venice was not going to win by strength. It was going to win by being necessary. But indispensability requires something to offer, something rare, something that cannot be found close to home, something that only moves through the world along routes that most men are afraid to travel. And in the city of Alexandria, at that very moment, wrapped in a merchant's basket, beneath layers of pork and cabbage to fool the customs officials who would never reach inside, something extraordinary was about to begin its journey north. Something that would give Venice not just a trade good, but a soul. Most cities are given their patron saints. Venice stole it. It is 828. The marketplace in Alexandria hums with the particular chaos of a port city that has never once slowed down. Spices from the east move in sacks along the waterfront. Merchants argue in 4 languages. The air carries salt and fish oil and the sharp sweetness of cinnamon that has traveled farther than most men will ever walk. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, 2 Venetian merchants are doing something that could get them killed. Their names are Buono da Malamocco and Restico da Turcello. Not heroes, not soldiers, not priests. Merchants, nervous ones. They are carefully, methodically, wrapping a human corpse in layers of cabbage leaves and slabs of pork. The pork is the clever part. The Muslim customs officials who inspect outgoing cargo will not touch it, will not reach through it, will not look too carefully at what might be hidden beneath it. Buono and Ristico are counting on that. They are counting on revulsion to do what bribery might not. What they are wrapping is the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist, the author of one of the 4 Gospels, dead for nearly 800 years, and they are stealing it. Stop and sit with that for a moment. This is not a military campaign. There is no army at the gates. There are just 2 men with clammy hands and pounding hearts, stuffing a saint into a basket and hoping nobody looks too closely on the way to the dock. But why? Why did Venice need this particular act of sacred larceny? Why risk everything to bring home the bones of a man who had been dead since the 1st century? Because bones in the 9th century were not just bones, they were power. They were legitimacy. They were the physical presence of the divine on earth. A city that held the relics of a major saint held something more valuable than gold. It held the attention of God, or at least it could make that argument. And Venice, as we have already seen, was very good at making arguments. Venice had a patron saint at the time. His name was Theodore, Saint Theodore, a perfectly respectable martyr. But Theodore was a Byzantine saint. He had been assigned to Venice by Constantinople. He was, in the most direct sense, a symbol of someone else's authority over the city. Every time a Venetian looked at the column in the Piazzetta where Theodore's statue stood, they were looking at a reminder that Venice belonged to somebody else. Mark was different. Mark was the evangelist who, according to legend, had been told by an angel while passing through the lagoon that his body would one day rest there. Pax tibi, Marseille, evangelista mais. Hic requiesce corpus tuum. Peace be with you, Mark, my evangelist. Here your body will rest. That legend was old. It predated the theft. But Buono and Rustico used it. They wrapped the crime in prophecy. They did not steal a saint. They fulfilled a divine promise. They were just the instruments of God's plan. It is one of the most audacious pieces of political theology in history. And it worked. Back on the dock in Alexandria, the basket is loaded. The customs officials come. They see the pork. they recoil. They wave the cargo through. Bruno and Ristico do not run. Running would draw attention. They walk. They board their ship. They sail north, across the Mediterranean, with a dead evangelist hidden in their hold. And somewhere on that voyage, in the creak of the timber and the slap of the waves, the Republic of Venice quietly acquired a soul. The relics arrived in Venice, and the response was immediate. The Doge at the time, Giustiniano Pazzi, ordered the construction of a chapel beside the ducal palace to house them. This first church was modest. It would not stay modest for long. What grew on that site over the following centuries would become the Basilica di San Marco, one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world. Golden mosaics covering every surface. Light filtered through stone until it looks liquid. A building that does not feel like it was made by human hands, which was, of course, entirely the point. But the basilica was not just beautiful. It was a statement. And the statement was this: Venice answers to God, not to the Pope, not to the Emperor in Constantinople, not to anyone who sits on a throne made by human ambition. The city had the body of an evangelist. It had the angel's prophecy. It had divine authorization. And if you disagreed, you were not arguing with Venice. You were arguing with heaven. Think about what that meant politically. The Pope in Rome claimed authority over all of Christendom. The Byzantine Emperor claimed authority over Venice as a territory of the empire. Both of those claims had weight. Both had military and economic power behind them. But Venice had just placed itself in a category that neither Rome nor Constantinople could easily challenge. You cannot excommunicate a city that houses the bones of an evangelist without looking like you are the one defying God. It was the same calculation from chapter 2. Make yourself indispensable. Position yourself where the powerful cannot move against you without cost. Only now the currency was not trade routes. It was sanctity. Saint Theodore's column did not come down. The Venetians were too careful for that kind of open provocation. Theodore kept his place in the Piazzetta, but everyone knew. The new basilica dwarfed everything around it. The winged lion of St. Mark began appearing on flags, on coins, on the prows of ships. The lion held an open book in times of peace. In times of war, it held a sword. Either way, it was watching. Either way, it was Venice's lion now. Not Byzantium's, not Rome's, Venice's. And the city did not just take the saint, it absorbed him. It became him. The phrase on the flag, Pax tibi Marse Evangelista, was not just a religious motto. It was a territorial claim. The angel had spoken those words over the lagoon, over this specific water, over this specific mud and reed and salt air. God had pointed at this place and said, "Here." Venice had simply been paying attention. There is something genuinely unsettling about watching a city construct its own mythology in real time and then begin to believe it, because that is what happened. The theft was calculated. The use of the legend was deliberate. The political theology was engineered, but within a generation, the story had hardened into truth. Children grew up knowing that an angel had promised Venice to St. Mark. Doges swore their oaths beneath his golden mosaics. Sailors prayed to him before crossing seas that had swallowed better men. The manufactured became the sacred became the real. That is not cynicism. That is how cities work. Every origin story is partly constructed. Every founding myth contains a choice about what to remember and what to let go quiet. Rome had Romulus and Remus. Athens had Athena. Venice had a stolen saint and a basket of poor. The mechanism is the same. You take something extraordinary, you attach a divine explanation to it, and you repeat the story until it becomes the ground your children stand on. What made Venice unusual was the speed and the self-awareness of it. The Venetians knew what they were doing. Buono and Rustico were not mystics. They were merchants. They understood value. They understood that a city with a great saint was worth more than a city without one. They made a commercial calculation about the divine, and then they dressed it in prophecy and gold leaf and let the centuries do the rest. By the time the basilica reached its full glory, centuries after the theft, the building itself had become the argument. You walked inside, and the light hit you, and the gold blazed from every surface, and the faces of apostles and angels looked down at you from impossible heights, and it was very hard to remember that this had all begun with 2 nervous men and a basket of cabbage. That was the genius of it. The beauty overwhelmed the origin. The sacred consumed the cynical. And yet, the unease remains, because a city that learns to construct its own legitimacy also learns to believe its own stories, and a city that believes it has divine authorization for its choices is capable of extraordinary things, some of them beautiful, some of them terrible. Venice would do both. It would build cathedrals and destroy them. It would protect trade and weaponize it. It would speak of justice and practice ruthlessness, and through all of it, the winged lion would watch from the flags, with that open book or that upraised sword, patient and golden and utterly certain of itself. That certainty was the real inheritance of 828, not the bones, not the building. The certainty, a city that had once been nothing but a collection of refugees in a marsh, now had a saint who had been promised to them by an angel before they even existed. The timeline didn't matter. The logic didn't need to hold. The story was true because Venice needed it to be true, and Venice would spend the next 1,000 years proving, in ways that would astonish the world, that sometimes the story you tell about yourself becomes the most real thing there is. Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello sailed home with their cargo and their secret and their alibi written in prophecy. The Doge received them. The relics were installed. The building began to rise, and Venice looked at itself in the new light of a stolen saint and saw, perhaps for the first time, what it might become. Not a subject, not a tributary, not a useful hinge between competing empires, something more, something chosen. But a city cannot eat mythology. It cannot defend itself with mosaics. The real power of Venice, the power that will one day make it the richest place on earth, is not spiritual at all. It is commercial. And it is about to receive a gift so extraordinary that it will change the entire Mediterranean world. Not stolen this time, negotiated, with an empire so vast and so confident in its own dominance that it hands Venice the keys to its own kingdom without ever noticing what it has done. Picture a ledger, not a grand document with gold seals and imperial signatures. A working ledger, ink-stained, worn at the edges, filled with columns of figures in a merchant's careful hand. Numbers that represent bolts of silk, jars of spice, bags of salt. Numbers that, if you know how to read them, tell you something extraordinary happened in 1082. That year, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos put his seal on a document that would reshape the Mediterranean world. He called it a crucible, a golden bull. And what it contained was not a military alliance or a territorial grant. It was something far more powerful. It was permission to trade in 23 of the most important Byzantine ports, free of all customs duties, free of all taxes, with guaranteed property rights that Byzantine administrators could not touch, with warehouses and wharves inside Constantinople itself, the greatest city in the world. Every other European merchant who sailed into those same ports paid crippling tariffs. Venetians paid nothing. Nothing. Let that settle for a moment. In a world where every transaction was taxed, where every port had its toll collectors and its gatekeepers, Venice had just been handed a playing field that nobody else could stand on. Alexios had not done this out of love for Venice. He had done it out of desperation. The Normans were pressing hard against Byzantine territory in the Adriatic. Alexios needed ships. Venice had ships. He offered what he had to offer, which was access to the richest trading network in the known world. And Venice, with the calm precision of a merchant who has just been offered exactly what he needs but will not let his face show it, agreed. The ink dried. The seal was pressed. And Venice went to work. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that battles are dramatic. There were no trumpets, no cavalry charges, no walls falling. What happened was quieter than that, and in the long run, far more devastating to everyone who stood in Venice's way. Venetian merchants spread through the Byzantine Empire like water, finding cracks in stone. They had always been present in Constantinople, trading salt and slaves and timber for silk and spices and gold. But now they moved differently. They moved without the weight of tariffs slowing them down. They could undercut every competitor in every port because their costs were simply lower, not because they were smarter, though many of them were, not because their ships were faster, though the arsenal was already building remarkable vessels, simply because an emperor had decided, in a moment of military need, that Venice's help was worth the price of an entire commercial empire. The Fondacci appeared along the coast like outposts of a quiet invasion. These were not just warehouses, they were Venetian communities. Clusters of merchants, factors, scribes, and guards who lived inside the Byzantine world but answered to Venice. They had their own rules, their own courts, their own rhythms. A Venetian merchant in Alexandria or Thessaloniki woke up in the morning and lived, for all practical purposes, as if he had never left the lagoon. He spoke Venetian. He kept accounts in Venetian measures. He sent his profits home to Venice, where they would be reinvested, lent out, multiplied. The colleganza made this multiplication possible in ways that still feel modern. Here is how it worked. A wealthy merchant, someone with capital but perhaps not the appetite for months at sea, would put up roughly 3/4 of the investment for a trading voyage. A younger man, ambitious, willing to face the storms and the pirates and the grinding tedium of long months in foreign ports, would put up the rest and do the actual trading. When the ship came home, they split the profits according to what had been agreed before departure. This was not charity, it was architecture. It spread risk across multiple investors while giving men without great inherited wealth a path to fortune. A successful voyage could transform a young Venetian's life. Several successful voyages could make him a power in the city. The system breathed. It expanded. It pulled ambitious men into the commercial orbit of Venice and bound them to it with the most durable of all chains, which is the chain of shared profit. And the profits were extraordinary. Silk from Byzantium, spices from the Arab world carried overland to ports where Venetian factors were already waiting. Pepper from the east, worth its weight in silver in the markets of northern Europe. Cotton and dyes and precious stones, and moving the other direction, out of Venice and toward the east, the raw materials that empires always need. Timber for ships, metal for weapons, salt, always salt, the great preservative without which armies could not march and fish could not survive the winter. Salt deserves a moment of its own. Venice had been in the salt business since the 7th century, producing it at Chioggia. But as the trading empire grew, so did the salt operation. Venetian merchants bought salt production rights across the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, Algeria, Crimea, Sardinia, Ibiza, Crete, Cyprus. The routes they built to collect salt became the same routes they used to carry everything else. A ship sailing from Cyprus with salt might also carry Indian spices that had come overland through the Arab world. The cargo diversified, the profits compounded, and Venice, with the instinct of a state that had been managing water since before it was a city, turned salt into a monopoly that would eventually generate 15% of the entire income of the Republic. 15% from salt. But the commercial machine needed a physical foundation, and that foundation was the arsenal. The word itself is Arabic, from Dar al-Sinaa, meaning house of manufacture. Venice had borrowed the word and built something that had no equal in Europe. A shipyard that was not just a place where ships were built, but a system for building them. Workers who specialized in specific tasks. Timber stored in sequence so it could be used as it aged to exactly the right hardness. Rope walks and sail lofts and forges. The arsenal could launch a fully equipped warship in a day, not in a week. In a day, when Venice needed to project power onto the sea did not have to wait long. The ships that came out of the arsenal carried the goods that the Collegenza financed and the Fondacci distributed. Each piece of the system depended on the others. Remove the arsenal and the ships rot. Remove the Collegenza and the capital dries up. Remove the Fondacci and the goods have nowhere to go. But together, working in concert, they formed something that no other city in Europe had assembled, a fully integrated commercial empire, running from the Lagoon to the edges of the known world. And the political system was tightening around this commercial machine like a hand around a tool made specifically for it. Only the patriciate and noble families whose names appeared in the right registers could engage in long-distance trade. This was not an accident. It was policy. The men who controlled the politics of Venice were the same men who owned the ships and funded the voyages and collected the profits. There was no gap between the government and the merchant class because they were the same class. When Venice negotiated the trading privilege, the men doing the negotiating were the men who would personally profit from it. When Venice went to war to protect a trade route, the men ordering the war were the men whose wealth depended on that route staying open. This created a kind of clarity that other medieval states lacked entirely. Venice did not make decisions for reasons of dynastic honor or religious glory or personal ambition, though all of those things existed in Venice as they exist everywhere. Venice made decisions for reasons of commerce, and commerce, unlike honor, can be calculated. The wealth that poured into the city after 1082 changed what Venice looked like, and what it smelled like, and what it smelled like. Walk through the Rialto market on a morning in the mid-12th century, and your senses are overwhelmed before you have taken 10 steps. The sharp bite of pepper from the east. The sweetness of cane sugar, still a luxury in most of Europe. The thick, oily smell of baled cloth from Flanders and the Levant. Merchants arguing prices in a dozen languages. The clink of coins being tested and weighed, because a Venetian money changer knew the difference between a good Byzantine gold piece and a debased one by the sound it made when it hit the table. The city was filling with people who wanted a share of what Venice had built, Germans from the Holy Roman Empire, who were required to stay in the Fondaco dei Tedeschi and trade only through Venetian intermediaries. Tuscans from Florence, Greeks, Croats, Jews who offered credit at rates lower than anyone else and who would eventually be confined to the ghetto after 1516, but who in these earlier centuries lived mostly in Mestre and did business across the causeway. Venice was not a tolerant city in any sentimental sense, but it was a practical one. If you had something Venice needed, whether that was capital or skill or access to a market, Venice would find a way to use you. And underneath all of this, beneath the ledgers and the convoys and the salt monopoly and the arsenal, there was something that the Golden Bull had made possible, but that no document could fully capture. Venice had stopped thinking of itself as a participant in Mediterranean trade. It had started thinking of itself as the center of it. That shift in self-conception is everything. A participant competes. A center controls. Venice was building the infrastructure of control. The routes, the colonies, the financial instruments, the political relationships, with the quiet certainty of a city that had already decided how the story ended. But certainty is dangerous, and dominance creates enemies the way warm water creates storms. In Constantinople, the Byzantines had been watching. They had watched the Venetian fondaci grow. They had watched Venetian merchants undercut their own traders in their own ports. They had watched the wealth flow west across the Adriatic and wondered, with growing unease, what exactly they had agreed to in 1082. The deal had saved the empire from the Normans, but the medicine was beginning to look worse than the disease. By 1171, the Emperor Manuel the Comnenus had made a decision. He would not negotiate. He would not send a letter. He would not give Venice any warning at all. On a single morning, without a word of advance notice, Byzantine forces across the empire arrested every Venetian merchant they could find. Thousands of them. They seized their ships. They seized their goods. They seized their warehouses and their account books and everything inside the fondaci that Venice had spent a century building. In one morning, the Byzantine emperor attempted to erase a commercial empire. Venice would not forget this. Venice never forgot anything. The merchants who escaped came home to the lagoon with empty hands and a rage that had nowhere immediate to go. The wealth of a century had been swallowed in a single day. The city that had learned to turn mythology into power, that had stolen a saint and built a theology of commercial destiny, now had a wound that festered for 30 years. 30 years of watching Constantinople. 30 years of waiting, because Venice was patient in the way that only cities built on water can be patient. It understood in its bones that the tide always turns, and when the moment came, Venice would not waste it. The moment would come in 1204, and the entire world would feel it. 10,000 Venetian merchants arrested on the same morning. Their ships seized at anchor. Their warehouses emptied by soldiers who had been given orders before dawn. Their account books, their contracts, their entire commercial lives, all of it gone before most of them had eaten breakfast. Venice did not forget. Venice did not forgive. Venice waited. But first, Venice bled. The city that had spent a century building its commercial empire inside the Byzantine world now watched that empire dissolve in a single coordinated act of imperial will. Emperor Manuel the Komnenos had moved with a precision that was almost admirable. No warnings, no negotiations, no diplomatic letters arriving in the Lagoon with polite ultimatums. Just soldiers appearing at every Venetian fondaco across the empire simultaneously, and the sound of doors being forced open in the grey morning light. The smell of salt water and spilled wine as barrels were rolled out of cellars that Venetian families had filled over generations. The merchants who escaped came home with nothing. Some arrived barefoot. Some arrived sick. All of them arrived angry. And Venice, being Venice, turned that anger into a decision. The decision was war. In 1172, the city launched a military expedition against the Byzantine Empire. It was the kind of response he would expect from a city that had just been humiliated in front of the entire Mediterranean world. A fleet, soldiers, the full weight of Venetian institutional fury pointed eastward across the Aegean. The Doge who ordered it was Vitali II Michiel, and what happened next would haunt the Lagoon for a generation. The campaign failed. Not in battle. Not against Byzantine walls or Byzantine soldiers. The fleet was destroyed by something far older and far less dramatic than war. Disease moved through the ships like fire through dry wood. Men who had boarded the galleys healthy and furious died sweating in the dark below decks, their throats closing, their skin burning. The plague took most of the fleet. It took thousands of men. It took the entire expedition and left Venice with nothing to show for its rage except empty berths in the arsenal and families waiting on the docks for ships that would not come back. When the survivors returned to the Lagoon, the city turned on the Doge who had sent them. Vitali II Michiel was murdered in the streets. Stabbed, not by a foreign enemy, by his own people. That is what humiliation and grief do to a city. They find a target. Venice buried its dead, elected a new Doge, and went quiet. But quiet is not the same as still. Quiet in Venice meant something was being planned now. Here is where the story changes. Here is where it stops being about a fleet or a war and starts being about a man. His name was Enrico Dandolo, and if you want to understand what Venice did next, you have to understand what had been done to him. The exact circumstances of Dandolo's blindness are not recorded with the precision historians would prefer. What is known as this? He suffered severe damage to his eyesight, almost certainly during the crisis of 1171 and its aftermath. Some accounts say it happened in Constantinople itself during the Byzantine crackdown. Some say it came later. What every account agrees on is the result. By the time Enrico Dandolo rose to prominence, he could barely see. Think about what that means for a Venetian merchant and diplomat. A man whose entire world was built on reading contracts, reading faces, reading the subtle signals of a negotiation across a table in a foreign city. A man who had spent his life moving through the most sophisticated commercial networks in the medieval world, and who now moved through that world in a permanent half-darkness. A lesser man would have retreated, would have handed his affairs to younger eyes and younger legs, and found a comfortable chair near a warm fire. Dandolo did not retreat. He sharpened. There is something that happens to certain people when the world takes something fundamental from them. They stop wasting energy on anything that does not matter. Every conversation becomes a calculation. Every silence becomes information. Every word spoken by another person lands with a weight that sighted men miss entirely, because sighted men are always half distracted by what they can see. Dandolo had no such distraction. He listened. He remembered. He planned across time scales that other men found uncomfortable. By 1192, Enrico Dandolo was elected Doge of Venice. He was already very old, ancient by the standards of a world where most men were dead by 50, and he brought with him into the ducal office something that 20 years of diplomatic experience had not fully formed, but 20 years of half-blindness had perfected, a patience so cold and so precise that it functioned less like a human quality and more like a weapon. The wound from 1171 had never closed. Venice had never received compensation for the seized goods, the stolen ships, the emptied warehouses. The Byzantine Empire had simply absorbed the wealth of a century of Venetian labor and moved on. And now the man sitting in the ducal chair was a man who had almost certainly been blinded in Byzantine territory during a Byzantine act of imperial aggression, and who had spent the intervening decades watching Constantinople with eyes that could no longer fully see it. But he did not need to see it clearly. He knew exactly where it was. Now the stage needed one more piece, and in 1201, that piece arrived in Venice in the form of 6 French knights. They came as envoys. They came on behalf of the great lords of France and Flanders, who were preparing to launch a new crusade, the 4th attempt to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. They needed ships. They needed supplies. They needed the only naval power in the Mediterranean, capable of moving an army across open water and delivering it to the shores of the Holy Land. They needed Venice. The envoys were received with the full ceremony of the Venetian state. They stood in the great hall and made their request, and Enrico Dandolo, nearly blind, more than 90 years old, sat and listened to every word. What the Crusaders needed was transport for 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. They needed food and supplies for 9 months. They needed the Venetian fleet assembled and ready. Dandolo did not answer immediately. He sent the envoys away and consulted the Great Council. Then he returned with a number: 85,000 silver marks. It was an enormous sum. It was, in fact, a sum that the crusading lords of France and Flanders almost certainly could not raise. The envoys agreed to it anyway, because they had no other option, and because men in the grip of holy purpose are sometimes the last to notice the practical details of what they have just signed. A contract was drawn up. Venice would provide the ships. Venice would provide the supplies. Venice would even contribute 50 armed war galleys of its own, at Venice's own expense. In exchange, Venice would receive the 85,000 marks, plus half of all territory and treasure captured during the campaign. The Crusaders celebrated. They had their fleet. God's holy war would proceed. And here is the thing that nobody in that room said out loud. The thing that Dandolo carried behind his clouded eyes like a stone he had been holding for 30 years. The Crusaders were never going to be able to pay, not because they were dishonest, not because the lords of France and Flanders had no intention of honoring their agreement, but because gathering 85,000 silver marks from the scattered nobility of Northern Europe was a logistical and financial challenge of staggering complexity, the money would have to be collected from hundreds of individual knights and barons, each of whom had taken the cross with more enthusiasm than accounting. The gap between what they owed and what they could actually deliver would be enormous. Dandolo knew this. He had spent 50 years in the most sophisticated commercial republic in the world. He had negotiated contracts in Constantinople and Alexandria and every trading city in between. He understood the arithmetic of crusading finance the way a surgeon understands the weight of a blade. He knew what would happen when the Crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202 and found they were short. He knew what a man in debt, standing on a foreign dock with an army behind him and nowhere to go, will agree to when offered a way out. He knew what he would ask for. The smell of candle wax hung in the air of the council chamber. Outside, the lagoon moved in its slow, grey way, indifferent to everything. Somewhere in the city, a church bell rang the hour, the sound traveling across water the way sound always does in Venice, arriving slightly changed, slightly softened, as if the lagoon itself was editing it. Dandolo sat with the signed contract in front of him. His hands were steady, old men's hands mapped with veins but steady. He had been waiting for something like this for a very long time. Not this specific contract, not these specific crusaders, but this specific shape of opportunity, where a force too large to control needed a navigator, and where the navigator could choose the destination. The Crusaders thought they were hiring a shipping company. They were handing the wheel to the most patient, most calculating, most personally motivated man in the Mediterranean world. A man whose city had been robbed. A man who had been blinded. A man who had watched Constantinople from across the Adriatic for 3 decades and had never, not once, stopped thinking about what justice might look like. The Fourth Crusade now belonged to Venice in every way that mattered. The ships were Venetian. The route was Venetian. The logic of the entire enterprise would bend, slowly and then all at once, toward Venetian purpose. And the Crusaders, brave and faithful and genuinely committed to the liberation of Jerusalem, had no idea. They were thinking about the Holy Land. They were thinking about God and glory and the sacred city. They were not thinking about what a 90-year-old blind Venetian Doge thinks about in the quiet hours before dawn, when the lagoon is dark and still and the old grievances come back with their full original weight. The contract was signed. The Crusaders were celebrating. Enrico Dandolo, ancient and nearly sightless, sat in the particular stillness of a man who has finally, after 30 years, begun to move. He had not forgotten 1171. He had not forgotten the seized ships and the emptied warehouses and the merchants who came home barefoot. He had not forgotten what it felt like to lose your sight in a city that was not yours, in a crisis engineered by an emperor who considered Venice a useful tool rather than a sovereign power. He had carried all of it through every year of his blindness and every year of his rise. And now he was the Doge, and the crusade was in his hands, and the fleet was being built in the arsenal with the particular focused energy of Venetian craftsmen who had been doing this work for centuries. The ships would be ready. The supplies would be loaded. The army of God would assemble on the docks of Venice. And then Enrico Dandolo, 90 years old and barely able to see the faces of the men around him, would smile the smile of a city that never forgot anything. The question that should have terrified every person in that room. The question that the French knights and Flemish lords were too full of holy purpose to think to ask was a simple one. It had a simple shape. It was the kind of question that only becomes obvious after the answer has already destroyed something irreplaceable. The contract was signed. Venice would carry the crusade. 80,000 crusaders would board Venetian ships and sail toward a destination they believed was Jerusalem. Where, exactly, does an old blind Venetian Doge intend to steer 80,000 crusaders? Because it is not Jerusalem. 4 bronze horses stand above the entrance of San Marco in Venice. They have stood there for centuries, green with age, frozen mid-stride, as if they are about to leap from the facade and gallop out across the piazza. Tourists photograph them every day. Most do not ask where they came from. They came from Constantinople. They came from the Hippodrome, the great racing stadium at the heart of the most magnificent city in the medieval world. They came from a place that no longer exists, stripped from a civilization that Venice helped destroy, loaded onto ships, and carried home like furniture. That is what this chapter is about. In April of 1204, a crusade that was supposed to liberate Jerusalem instead tore apart the largest Christian city on earth. Venice watched. Venice planned. And when the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, Venice loaded the best of what remained onto its ships and sailed home. The walls of Constantinople appeared on the horizon from the deck of a Venetian galley sometime in the spring of 1203. Imagine standing there, the salt air sharp in your lungs, the creak and pull of the rigging overhead, and then that skyline rising out of the sea, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia catching the morning light, the land walls stretching for miles along the shore, the city enormous and gleaming and ancient. The crusaders on board had never seen anything like it. Many of them said so afterward. They had thought Paris was a great city. They had thought Venice was extraordinary. Constantinople made both of them look like villages. Enrico Dandolo stood somewhere on that deck, 90 years old, nearly blind, and said nothing that was recorded. But you can imagine what he felt. He had been here before. He knew exactly what was behind those walls. The plan on paper was almost respectable. A deposed Byzantine emperor named Isaac II had been overthrown by his own brother. Isaac's son, a young prince also named Alexios, had come to the Crusaders with a proposition. "Restore my father to his throne," he told them, "and I will pay you everything Venice is owed. I will give you military support for your campaign, and I will bring the Eastern Church back under Rome." It was a remarkable offer. It was also, as Dandolo almost certainly knew, an offer the young man had absolutely no ability to keep. The Crusaders had already made one detour by this point. They had stopped first at Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast, a city that had once belonged to Venice and had since placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Dandolo wanted it back. The Crusaders besieged it, breached its walls, and took it by force in November of 1202. Pope Innocent III was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade. Every man on those ships technically was now cut off from God. The Crusaders rode back to Rome to explain themselves. Dandolo, who had engineered the whole thing, did not seem particularly troubled by the Pope's anger. Zara was just the first turn. Constantinople was the destination. It had always been the destination. The young Alexios was crowned alongside his restored father in the summer of 1203, just as planned. And then everything began to unravel, exactly as anyone paying attention might have expected. The Byzantine treasury was nearly empty. The promises Alexios had made to the Crusaders, the enormous payments, the military support, the submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome were promises that the people of Constantinople had never agreed to and would not accept. The city began to turn against its new rulers. Riots broke out. A fire that started near the harbor burned for days and destroyed entire neighborhoods, filling the air with a smell of scorched stone and wet ash. Alexios IV was strangled by a usurper in January of 1204. His father Isaac died shortly after, of grief or illness or both. The Crusaders were now owed an enormous amount of money by a man who was dead in a city that hated them, with no way to continue to Jerusalem and no way to go home. Dandolo had a solution. On April the 9th, 1204, the crusading fleet attacked Constantinople from the sea. The first assault failed. The defenders on the walls held, and the attackers fell back. For 2 days the city held. Then, on April the 12th, the wind shifted. 2 ships lashed together managed to get their ladders against a section of the wall. A handful of men got over. Then more. A gate was broken from the inside. The tide outside poured through. Constantinople fell to Christian soldiers on April the 13th, 1204. What followed for 3 days was not a battle. It was a catastrophe. The Crusaders poured through the streets of the greatest city in the medieval world, and they took everything. They broke into churches and stripped the altars. They dragged icons from the walls and hacked off the gold frames. They pried the gems from reliquaries. They found the libraries, and they did not know what they were looking at. Centuries of accumulated learning in Greek, texts that existed nowhere else in the world, and they burned them or left them to rot in the rain. They found the tombs of the emperors and broke them open looking for jewelry. A French soldier who was there, a knight named Villehardouin, wrote about it afterward. He said the city was rich beyond anything he had imagined. He said the looting went on for days. He said the wealth of the place was almost impossible to describe. What he did not describe with the same energy was what the people of the city experienced. The screaming in the streets, the smoke rising from the Hagia Sophia, where a woman described by chroniclers as a prostitute was placed on the patriarch's throne, while soldiers drank the communion wine and sang. The families hiding in cellars while their doors shook, the particular silence that falls over a city when it has been completely broken. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine official who survived and wrote his own account, described what the Crusaders did with a grief so controlled it reads like a man who has run out of room for feeling. He wrote about statues smashed, about art destroyed that the world would never see again, about the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years reduced to rubble and ash in 72 hours. He had watched it happen from inside the city, moving through streets he had known his entire life, and the man who emerges from his pages is not angry. He is beyond anger. He is describing the end of a world. And where was Dandolo during all of this? He was watching. He was cataloguing. This is the thing that makes the Fourth Crusade so specifically, so distinctly Venetian in its horror. The French knights looted with the chaos of men who had been told God approved of whatever they did next. The Venetians looted with a spreadsheet, while the Crusaders broke things and burned things and destroyed things in their frenzy. The Venetian teams moved through the city with a different energy entirely. They were looking for specific objects. They were making selections. They were professionals. The 4 bronze horses came down from the hippodrome. They were ancient even then, possibly cast in the 4th century before the Common Era, possibly older, and they had stood above the starting gates of Constantinople's great stadium for nearly 900 years. Venetian workers took them down carefully, wrapped them, and loaded them onto ships. They would eventually be mounted above the entrance of San Marco, where they stand today. The Pala d'Oro, the great golden altarpiece in San Marco, was already extraordinary before 1204. Dandolo had it expanded. New panels were added, new gems were set into the gold, objects taken from the churches of Constantinople incorporated into the design. Today it contains over 1,300 pearls, 400 garnets, and roughly 300 other precious stones. Every one of those stones has a history. Most of that history is Byzantine. The porphyry tetrarchs, the small red stone sculpture of 4 Roman emperors embracing that now juts from the corner of San Marco, was taken from the Philadelphion in Constantinople. You can still see on the original pedestal back in Istanbul the mark where it was cut away. Relics poured into Venice, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, the alleged head of John the Baptist, objects that the entire medieval world considered sacred, and that Venice now possessed in quantities that made it the most relic-rich city in Christendom. Some were kept, many were sold. The Latin emperors who came after would continue this trade for decades, selling off Constantinople's sacred objects to fund a state that was already dying from the moment it was born. On May the 9th, 1204, the Crusaders elected their own emperor. Baldwin IX of Flanders was crowned in the Hagia Sophia on May the 16th, in a ceremony that followed Eastern Roman practices almost exactly. 5 entities now simultaneously claim to be the Roman Empire: the Latin Empire in Constantinople, the Holy Roman Empire in the West, and 3 Byzantine successor states in Nicaea, in Trebizond, and in Eborus, each one led by Greek aristocrats who had escaped the sack and were already planning how to return. Venice did not want the throne. Venice had never wanted the throne. The throne was a burden. The throne required defending and administering and fighting over. What Venice wanted was the ports, the islands, the sea lanes, the trade routes, the machinery of commerce. In the Partitio, the formal division of Byzantine territory signed on the 1st of October 1204, Venice received 3/8 of the entire empire. Crete, islands across the Aegean, ports along the Greek coast, strategic positions from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. The Doge of Venice was granted a title that captures the Venetian ambition with almost comic precision. Lord of 1/4 and 1/2 of the Roman Empire, not emperor, not king. Lord of the fractions, Lord of the percentages, Lord of exactly the pieces that mattered for moving ships and goods across water. The Doge did not rank as a vassal to the Latin emperor. He was something stranger and more powerful than that. He sat beside the empire, controlling 3/8 of its territory, independent of its authority, plugged into its infrastructure like a parasite that keeps the host just alive enough to be useful. Dandolo himself did not live to see the empire crumble. He died in 1205 in Constantinople and was buried in the Hagia Sophia. His tomb was reportedly later desecrated by the Byzantines when they eventually took the city back. Of course it was. The Latin Empire was born dying. The French and Flemish knights who ran it did not understand the Byzantine bureaucratic system, so they dismantled it. The Greek administrators who had kept the city functioning for centuries were dismissed or fled. Trade collapsed. Food became scarce. By the 1230s, Constantinople, even with its drastically reduced population, was running short of basic provisions. The lead roofs of the Great Palace were stripped and sold. The Emperor Baldwin II, desperate for funds, handed his own son to Venetian merchants as collateral for a loan. He sold the crown of thorns to the King of France. He sold everything he could find. The empire was liquidating itself piece by piece. Meanwhile, in Nicaea, the Byzantine successor state was growing stronger every decade. The Lascarid emperors built a functioning state, maintained the Orthodox Church, preserved Greek culture and learning, and waited. They fought the Latin Empire steadily, pushing it back, taking its territories in Asia Minor, surrounding it from the west, cutting it off. In July of 1261, a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos arrived near Constantinople with only 800 soldiers on a scouting mission. He learned from local farmers that the entire Latin garrison had left the city, along with the Venetian fleet, to raid a Nicaean island. The city was essentially unguarded. Strategopoulos found a secret passage through the walls. His men went through it in the dark. They surprised the guards. They opened the gates. The Latin Empire, the state that Venice had engineered into existence on the ruins of Byzantium, ended in a single night with 800 men and an unlocked door. Baldwin II fled to the harbour in whatever clothes he was wearing. The Venetians set fire to their own warehouses along the waterfront to prevent the Nicaeans from using them, and the flames lit the sky over the Golden Horn one more time. The Byzantine Empire was restored. The stolen city returned to its people after 57 years, but the horses were already in Venice. The gold was already in the Pala d'Oro. The relics were already distributed across the churches of the West. The sea routes and islands that Venice had taken were still in Venetian hands and would remain so for generations. The physical fabric of the greatest city in the medieval world, the libraries, the statues, the sacred objects of 1,000 years of civilization, was gone, burned or broken or loaded onto ships and carried away. The Catascioniates had written that even the Saracens were more merciful to Jerusalem than the Crusaders were to Constantinople. He was right. Venice was now, by any measure, the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. It controlled ports and islands and sea lanes from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. The stolen horses gleamed above San Marco. The stolen gold lined the Pala d'Oro. The stolen saint, whose bones had been smuggled out of Alexandria 4 centuries earlier, watched over it all from his golden basilica. Dandolo had wanted a reckoning. He had gotten an empire. But here is the thing about empires built on other people's ruins. They make enemies with very long memories. Somewhere in the rubble of what Venice had just helped destroy, in the courts of Nicaea and Trebizond and Epirus, in the monasteries where Greek monks were copying out the texts that had survived, in the hearts of every Byzantine who had watched their city burn, the survivors were already thinking about what comes next. Venice had spent 30 years nursing a grievance into a weapon. It should have known that grievances, once planted in the right soil, do not simply stop growing. The people whose world it had just ended were patient people. They had inherited an empire that was already 1,000 years old when Venice was still a collection of huts on a mudflat. They knew how to wait. And somewhere in the ruins of what Venice had just unmade, they were already planning how to get it all back. There is a stone mouth set into the wall of the Doge's palace. Small, unassuming, carved in the shape of a lion's face, with a slot where the open jaw should be. You could walk past it without noticing. Thousands of people did. But the Venetians knew what it was. They called it a bocca di leone, a mouth of the lion. And if you had information about a crime against the state, you folded your letter, slid it through those stone lips, and walked away. No signature required, no confrontation, no risk. The machinery of justice would take it from there, invisibly, and the Council of 10 would read your words in a room you would never enter and act on them in ways you would never see, while the rest of Europe was governed by whoever could kill their way to a throne. Venice had invented something stranger, more durable, and in some ways more frightening. A government designed to run forever without ever letting any single person run it. Think about what that actually means. Every kingdom Venice looked out at across the Adriatic ran on the same basic logic. A man was born to power, or seized it by force, or married into it, and then he held it until someone stronger took it from him. Simple, brutal, comprehensible. Venice had looked at that system for centuries and decided it was a catastrophic flaw in the architecture of civilization. So they built something else entirely. The empire that had just swallowed the Eastern Mediterranean needed to be governed, not just raided, not just trade, not just governed. Ports from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, islands scattered across the Aegean, trade routes that stretched to Alexandria and beyond. You cannot run that kind of operation on the strength of one man's will. One man dies, one man goes mad, one man's son turns out to be incompetent. Venice had seen what happened to states built on the shoulders of single rulers. It had watched the Byzantine Empire hollow itself out from the inside, emperor by emperor, dynasty by dynasty. So the Venetians built a system instead, and the system was the point. The Great Council sat at the center of it. By the 1300s, it held over 1,000 members, all male, all from families whose names were written in a register called the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book. Your name was either in it or it wasn't, and if it wasn't, the doors of real power stayed shut. The council elected magistrates, approved laws, exercised judicial oversight. It was the engine room of the whole republic. But here is where Venice gets interesting and strange and just a little cold. In 1297, under a doge named Pietro Gradenigo, Venice made a decision that would define it forever. They called it the Serrata, the closing, the lockout. The Great Council voted to make itself permanent and hereditary. From that point forward, membership passed through bloodlines. If your father had sat in that chamber, you would sit in it too. If he hadn't, you never would. The official explanation was stability, and it wasn't wrong. Venice had watched the other Italian cities tear themselves apart: Milan, Florence, Genoa, each one convulsed by factional violence, by strongmen rising on waves of popular fury, by the endless cycle of revolt and reprisal. Just a few years before the Serrata, a mob had formed in Venice's streets demanding that a popular admiral be named Doge by acclamation. The admiral, a man named Giacomo Tiepolo, refused the nomination. The Great Council held its nerve, but the moment had been close enough to feel. Gradenigo looked at that near miss and drew a lesson. You stabilize a political class by giving them a guaranteed stake in the system. You don't leave ambitious men outside the tent, hungry and resentful. You bring them inside, give them a title and a seat and a share of the dignity, and suddenly they have something to lose. The Serrata more than doubled the council's membership. Hundreds of families who had been circling the edges of power were brought in and given permanence. One man who thought he should have been included and wasn't, a certain Marin Bocconio, plotted to assassinate Gradenigo. He was hanged in 1300. The rest of the common people made no serious move to resist at all. The system worked. The question is, what kind of system it was. By 1323, membership required ancestors who had held high office. By 1319, You could not sit in the council until your 25th year of age. The Golden Book formalized everything. Roughly 200 families held the Republic between them, with thousands of noble men eventually holding the right to sit in the Great Hall of the Doge's palace. The hall had to be physically enlarged to hold them all. The building project stretched across decades. The Black Death interrupted it. They kept building anyway. And then there was the Council of Ten. It was born from crisis. In 1310, a group of old noble families, furious at their reduced influence after the Serrata, organized a coup. The Tiepolo conspiracy. They failed. Venice executed the ringleaders, and then, with the cold pragmatism that was always its defining quality, it asked a precise institutional question. How do you prevent this from happening again? The answer was the Council of Ten. 10 members, elected for a single year only, forbidden from holding other public offices, forbidden from having family ties with each other. Their mandate was state security, by any means necessary. The Bocche di Leone were their ears. Anonymous denunciations slipped through stone mouths in the walls of public buildings, fed information into a system that processed it in secret. The accused might never know who had reported them. The trial happened behind closed doors. The verdict came without public announcement. Men disappeared from Venetian life quietly, the way water disappears from a cracked vessel. Slowly, then completely. In 1355, the Council of Ten condemned a sitting doge to death. His name was Marino Faliero. He had tried to use popular support to expand his own power beyond what the Constitution allowed. He was 63 years old. He had served the Republic for decades. None of that mattered. He was beheaded in the courtyard of the Doge's palace on the very staircase where he had been inaugurated. His portrait in the Great Hall was painted over with black cloth. Where his face should have been, there was only darkness and a Latin inscription noting that he had been executed for his crimes. The message was architectural, permanent. The state is larger than any man who serves it, even the man at the top. Now look at the Doge's election process, because this is where Venetian political engineering becomes almost beautiful in its obsessive complexity. The system introduced in 1268 and kept in force until the Republic's final day involved 10 separate stages of election and lottery, deliberately interlocked to prevent any single family from controlling the outcome. 30 members of the Great Council were chosen by lot, reduced by lot to 9. The 9 chose 40. The 40 were reduced by lot to 12. The 12 chose 25. The 25 were reduced by lot to 9. The 9 elected 45. The 45 were reduced by lot to 11. The 11 chose 41. Those 41 finally elected the Doge, requiring at least 25 votes to succeed. 10 rounds, alternating between election and lottery. The lottery stages broke up any coalition that tried to form. The election stages ensured that quality and reputation still mattered. No family could predict, let alone control, who would emerge from that process. The mathematics of it made manipulation almost impossible. Almost. The Doge who emerged from all of this was a powerful symbol and a carefully constrained reality. His name appeared on coins. He commanded armies in wartime. He promulgated laws. Foreign governments addressed him as a sovereign prince. But he could not open dispatches from foreign powers without other officials present. He could not own property abroad. He could not appoint family members to positions of influence. After his death, commission reviewed every decision he had made, and his estate could be fined for any wrongdoing they discovered. Even in death, the state kept its hand on his shoulder. You could call this liberty. Venice called it liberty. The most serene republic, La Serenissima, presented itself to the world as proof that free men could govern themselves without kings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who worked as a secretary for the French ambassador in Venice in 1743, came away so struck by what he had seen that it planted the seed for his entire political philosophy. The social contract grew, partly, from watching Venice function, but stand back a little further and let your eyes adjust. The liberty Venice offered was liberty for roughly 1% of its population. The Golden Book held the names of a few hundred noble families in a city of tens of thousands. The cittadini, the middle class of merchants and professionals, had comfort and prosperity and no political voice whatsoever. The common people, the popolo, had the city around them and the lagoon beneath them, and almost nothing else. The Boctiglione gave everyone the power to denounce their neighbors. That is not quite the same thing as giving everyone a vote. What Venice had built was not democracy. It was something more durable and, in its own way, more elegant. It was an oligarchy so well designed that it looked like a republic. The checks and balances were real. The institutional paranoia was real. No single family could seize control, and the system had proved that by beheading a doge who tried, but the checks existed to protect the oligarchy from itself, not to protect ordinary Venetians from the oligarchy. The genius of it was that it worked. For centuries it worked, with a stability that made every neighboring kingdom look like chaos. The other Italian cities burned and rebuilt and burned again. Venice accumulated. Venice administered. Venice endured. The great hall of the Great Council filled with noble men, generation after generation, their names already written in the Golden Book before they were born, the whole beautiful, ruthless machine turning without friction, without revolution, without a single dynasty able to grip it and claim it as their own. A system this perfectly calibrated for the Mediterranean world of 1300 is about to face something it was never designed to survive. Not a rival fleet, not a rival empire, not a conspiracy or a coup or a foreign invasion. An enemy that doesn't come by sea, an enemy that moves through the air itself. And it is going to kill 1/3 of everyone Venice has ever known. When the plague arrived in Venice in 1447, it came as almost everything came to Venice by ship. And Venice responded the way it responded to every threat, not with prayers, not with pogroms, but with a system. Picture the docks at first light. The smell hits you before anything else. Not the usual salt and tar and fish. Something else. Something sweet and wrong and thick in the back of your throat. The sailors on the incoming galleys from the Black Sea port are not waving from the rails. Some are slumped. Some are not moving at all. The ships drift in like floating tombs, their cargo holds full of spice and silk and something invisible and merciless that has already eaten through crews of 30, 40, 50 men. The city that received them was, as we have seen, the most organized place in Europe. Committees for everything, records for everything, a bureaucratic reflex so deep it was practically instinct. And so when the death toll began to climb, when the bodies began appearing in the calai and floating in the smaller canals, Venice did not collapse into chaos. It counted, it measured, it responded. What it could not do, not at first, was stop it. The Black Death killed perhaps 60% of Venice's population. Sit with that number for a moment. 60%. In a city of perhaps 100,000 people, that is 60,000 dead. The narrow streets that had always hummed with commerce went quiet. The markets emptied. The great council chambers sat half-filled with men who looked at the seats of their dead colleagues and said nothing. Priests died giving last rites. Doctors died making house calls. Gravediggers died digging graves. The lagoon itself, that miraculous barrier that had protected Venice from every army, offered no protection at all against something you could not see and could not see and could not fight and could not negotiate with. The bells rang constantly. That was the sound of Venice in 1347 and 1348. Not the celebratory pealing of feast days. A low, relentless tolling that never quite stopped, because there was always another body, always another family shutting its door and hoping the door would hold. It never held. But here is what Venice did that no city in Europe had done before. It thought its way toward a solution. By 1377, the city had established a system of mandatory isolation for incoming ships. Vessels arriving from infected ports were required to anchor offshore and wait, 30 days at first. Then, because 30 days was not enough, 40 days, 40 giorni, 40 days. The word quarantine comes directly from that Venetian decision made by exhausted administrators in a city still haunted by the smell of its own dead. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about viruses. They knew only that something traveled with people, and that stopping the people for long enough sometimes stopped the something. The island of Lazaretto Nuovo, sitting in the northern lagoon, became the world's first quarantine station. Ships anchored there. Crews waited there. Cargo was aired and inspected there. It was not comfortable. 40 days on a small island in the lagoon, watching the city you were meant to trade with sitting just out of reach, is a particular kind of torment. But it worked, not perfectly, not always, but well enough that Venice survived subsequent outbreaks that devastated other cities far more completely. Think about what this represents. A city that had just lost 60% of its people did not abandon its trading system. It reformed it. It built an institution around the problem. The same governmental machinery that managed the arsenal and the grain supply and the election of the Doge turned its attention to public health and produced something the entire modern world still uses: the word quarantine. The concept of quarantine, both born in the Venetian lagoon, out of grief and pragmatism, and the deep Venetian conviction that every problem has a procedural solution. The machine kept running, damaged, diminished, grieving, but running. And then, before Venice had fully recovered, Genoa came. The Wars of Chioggia began in 1378. By that point, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa had been grinding for over a century. Two maritime empires, two trading networks, two sets of colonies strung across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They could not both win. They had both known this for a long time. The question was always which one would finally break the other. Genoa made its move. A Genoese fleet, allied with the King of Hungary and the Lord of Padua, struck at Venice from multiple directions at once. And for a moment, a genuinely terrifying moment, it looked like Venice was finished. The Genoese fleet captured Chioggia. Chioggia sits at the southern end of the lagoon, and if you stand on its walls, you can see Venice. Not metaphorically. Actually see it, shimmering across the water. The Genoese commander, Pietro Doria, reportedly told the Venetian envoys who came to negotiate that he would not stop until he had bridled the horses of Saint Mark. Those bronze horses, looted from Constantinople in 1204, standing above the Great Basilica. He wanted them. He wanted Venice on its knees. The Venetians went home from that meeting and started melting down their gold, not metaphorically. They stripped the treasury. They borrowed from their own nobles. They commissioned an emergency fleet. An old admiral named Vetta Pisani, who had actually been imprisoned by Venice for an earlier military failure, was released from jail and given command. The city that had spent a century perfecting its institutional caution threw caution aside and fought with everything it had. What followed was a grinding, brutal naval campaign in the shallow waters of the lagoon itself. Venice's own home waters. The Genoese were trapped when a Venetian fleet blocked the channels behind them. The besiegers became the besieged. Pietro Doria was killed by a stone cannonball during the fighting. His fleet, starving and exhausted, surrendered in June of 1381. Genoa never recovered. Not really. The war had cost both cities enormously, but Venice had the institutional depth to absorb the cost and rebuild. Genoa did not. The great Genoese commercial empire slowly fragmented after Chioggia, its colonies peeling away, its naval power diminishing decade by decade. Venice had eliminated its only true maritime pier. The machine kept running, but the world was changing around it in ways that no amount of institutional genius could fully control. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II took Constantinople. You already know the story if you've been watching this series. The last Roman emperor died in the streets of his city. The great walls that had held for 1,000 years finally fell, and the eastern anchor of the entire Mediterranean trading world, the city through which Venice had routed so much of its commerce, changed hands forever. Venice lost its trading quarter in Constantinople that day. It lost warehouses, property, relationships built over generations. A number of Venetian merchants were taken prisoner. The news arrived in Venice by fast galley, and the men who read the dispatches in the Doge's palace looked at each other across the table and felt the floor shift beneath them. But here is the thing about Venice that you have to understand by now. Venice did not do grief. Venice did calculation. Within a year, Venice had sent an ambassador to Mehmed. Within a year of the fall of Constantinople, the city that had lost its trading quarter there was already negotiating to get it back. Not all of it, not on the old terms, but something. Some foothold, some arrangement that would allow commerce to continue, because commerce was not just what Venice did. Commerce was what Venice was. The Capitulation Treaty of 1454 gave Venice formal trading rights within the Ottoman Empire. Venetian merchants received exemptions from local taxation. Their homes could not be searched. They answered to their own consul in legal disputes, not to Ottoman courts. Venice had turned catastrophic loss into a negotiated commercial relationship in under 12 months with the man who had just destroyed the city that Venice had depended on for 2 centuries. Mehmed had his own reasons for agreeing. A functioning trading relationship with Venice brought revenue. It brought skilled merchants. It brought access to Western goods and information. Empires, even conquering ones, need commerce. Both men at that table knew it. This is the quality in Venice that most defies easy moral judgment. The Venetians were Christians negotiating with the Sultan, who had just killed the last Christian emperor of the East. Other Italian cities called it betrayal. Venice called it survival, and honestly, looking at what Venice built from those negotiations, it is hard to argue with the result. The Ottoman Wars did not end there. They ground on for decades, for generations. Venice lost territory steadily through the second half of the 1400s. Negroponte, the large island the Venetians called their breadbasket in the Aegean, fell to Ottoman forces in 1470. The news of its fall caused genuine public grief in Venice. People wept in the streets. The Senate sat in stunned silence. The island had been Venetian for 200 years. The people there, many of them Christian, were now subjects of the Sultan. Venice sent more ambassadors, signed more treaties, kept trading. There is a specific kind of courage in that, even if it looks from the outside like cynicism. The Venetian merchants who set up their counting houses in Constantinople, who learned Ottoman Turkish, who built relationships with Ottoman officials and traded in Ottoman ports, were not traitors to their faith. They were people doing what Venetians had always done, finding the channel through which goods could move, following the current wherever it led. The Ottoman capitulation system that Venice helped pioneer became, over the following centuries, the framework through which all European powers negotiated commercial access to the East. The French would later take it further, signing their own capitulation treaties in 1569 and beyond. The English followed. The Dutch followed. But Venice was there first. Venice sat across the table from Mehmed's representatives in 1454 and worked out the basic architecture of how Christian merchants would operate inside an Islamic empire. That framework lasted in various forms until 1914. The machine kept running, battered, reduced, but still turning, and yet there is something elegiac about Venice in the second half of the 1400s that you cannot quite ignore. The city is still magnificent. The trade is still flowing. The arsenal is still building galleys. The Golden Book is still the center of political life. But the losses are accumulating in ways that cannot always be recovered from. Every island lost to the Ottomans is a link removed from the chain of Venetian power in the East. Every Venetian merchant killed or captured in a war zone is a relationship that cannot be rebuilt overnight. The city adapts. It always adapts. But adaptation has a cost, and the cost is paid in exhaustion, in treasure, in the slow narrowing of possibilities. There is a painting from this period, made by Gentile Bellini, who actually traveled to Constantinople at Mehmed's invitation to paint the Sultan's portrait. Think about that image. A Venetian painter sitting across from the Ottoman conqueror, capturing his face in oil and pigment. Commerce and culture and diplomacy all tangled together in one room, in one canvas. Venice finding a way to be present, to be relevant, to be indispensable, even to the man who had torn its world apart. Bellini came home. He brought the painting. He brought observations about Ottoman court culture that fed back into Venetian intelligence networks. Even art was a form of information gathering. Even beauty was, in Venice, a tool. The machine kept running, but outside the lagoon, outside the councils and the committees and the golden halls, the world was accelerating in a direction that no Venetian administrator had planned for. The Ottoman Wars had made the eastern trade routes more expensive, more dangerous, more uncertain. Spices that had once flowed through Alexandria and Constantinople to Venice and then to the rest of Europe were now moving through a gauntlet of conflict and taxation that ate into margins year by year. Someone was going to find another way. Everyone in Venice knew it. The question was whether Venice could be part of that new way, or whether the new way would simply bypass the lagoon entirely. In 1488, a Portuguese sailor named Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. He turned back before reaching India, but he had proved it could be done. He had shown that there was a sea route from Europe to the east that did not pass through the Mediterranean at all. 9 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey. He reached India by sea. He brought back spices. He brought back proof that the Venetian monopoly on Eastern trade was not a law of nature. It was a geographic accident. And geography, it turned out, could be rerouted. Venice has survived plague, survived Genoa, survived the fall of Constantinople, survived the Ottoman assault after Ottoman assault. Each blow has been absorbed, adapted to, survived. But survival has a cost. The trade routes that made Venice great are shifting. A Portuguese sailor has just rounded the tip of Africa, and the spice trade, the blood of Venice's commercial empire, is about to find a new road, one that does not pass through the lagoon. There is a particular kind of beauty that only appears in things that know they are dying. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as Venice slowly lost its grip on the world's trade routes, it painted, composed, and built with a ferocity that suggests it knew exactly what was happening and had decided that if it could not rule the seas forever, it would at least be beautiful forever. Stand for a moment in front of a Titian canvas, not a reproduction. The real thing. The colors are almost violent. Reds that burn. Golds that seem to generate their own light. Titian did not paint like a man in a declining city. He painted like a man in a city that had something to prove. And he did. So did Tintoretto, whose enormous canvases filled the walls of the Scuola Grande San Rocco with figures that seemed to be falling out of heaven itself. So did Veronese, whose feast scenes are so lavish, so crowded with silken flesh and wine, that the Inquisition once summoned him to explain why he had put dwarves and Germans and a man with a nosebleed into a painting of the Last Supper. Veronese's answer was magnificent. He said it was his artistic license. He changed the title instead. The painting survived. So did Venice. For a while. This is the paradox at the heart of the city's final centuries. The very decades when Venetian merchants were losing market share to Portuguese and Spanish traders, when the spice routes were quietly rerouting themselves around Africa and away from the lagoon, were also the decades when Venice produced some of the most extraordinary art, music, and architecture in human history. The wealth was draining. The culture was exploding. It is as if the city poured everything it had left into beauty, the way a fire burns brightest just before it goes out. Antonio Vivaldi was born in Venice in 1678, the son of a barber who moonlighted as a violinist at St. Mark's Basilica. The boy inherited the violin and something else entirely, something that turned sound into weather. The Four Seasons does not sound like a composition, it sounds like memory. Like standing at the edge of the lagoon in October, the cold coming off the water, the light going amber and thin. Vivaldi wrote for the Ospedale della Pietà, an orphanage for girls, whose musical performances drew audiences from across Europe. Princes came to Venice to hear orphan girls play Vivaldi's concertos. Think about what that means. The city had become a destination not for pepper and silk, but for sound. Claudio Monteverdi had come earlier, arriving in Venice in 1613 as the Maestro di Cappella at St. Mark's. He essentially invented opera, not the word, but the thing itself. The idea that music could carry the full weight of human emotion, that a voice and an orchestra together could make you feel grief you had never personally suffered. He did this in Venice, in a city already ancient, already starting its long exhale. He created something entirely new. And then there was the carnival. Every year, from the day after Christmas until the beginning of Lent, Venice put on a mask. Literally, the borta, the moretta, the morda bianco, white faces, black cloaks, the whole city transformed into a theater of anonymity. A nobleman and a fisherman could stand side by side at a gambling table and neither would know the other. A woman could walk alone through the streets without being recognized. For a few weeks each year, the rigid hierarchies that held Venetian society together simply dissolved into music and candlelight and the smell of wood smoke over the canals. The carnival was many things at once. It was genuine pleasure. It was also a pressure valve, a way of releasing social tension before it became dangerous. And it was, by the 18th century, the thing that was keeping the city's economy alive. Tourists came from London, from Paris, from Vienna. They came for the masks, for the gambling houses, for the courtesans who were reportedly the most educated women in Europe. One of those tourists was a man named Giacomo Casanova, who was not a tourist at all, but a native. Born in Venice in 1725, the son of an actress, he became the city's most famous export and its most perfect symbol. Charming, brilliant, completely unserious. A man who treated life as an extended performance and got away with it for decades until he didn't. Casanova was eventually arrested by the Council of Ten and imprisoned in the Leads, the notorious prison directly above the Doge's palace, where the summer heat turned the cells into ovens. He escaped. Of course he did. He was Venetian, but even his escape had a quality of theatre to it, a performance of cleverness rather than a genuine act of resistance. He fled to Paris and spent the rest of his life writing his memoirs in a castle in Bohemia, remembering Venice the way you remember a dream you know you will never have again. Meanwhile, the merchant fleets that had once made Venice the commercial center of the known world were shrinking. The numbers tell a cold story. In the early 16th century, Venetian galleys still carried the bulk of the spice trade between the East and Europe. By the end of that century, Portuguese ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope had cut that traffic by more than half. By the 17th century, Dutch and English traders had entered the game, and Venice was no longer even the second option. It was a memory of an option. The Arsenal, that extraordinary shipyard that had once produced a warship a day, still operated, but it was producing fewer ships, and those ships were patrolling a shrinking empire. The mainland territories, the terra firma, remained. Venice still controlled a significant stretch of northeastern Italy, still collected taxes from Verona and Padua and Vicenza. Andrea Palladio had built his extraordinary villas across that landscape, white geometry rising out of green fields, the pure mathematical beauty of a civilization expressing itself in stone, because it could no longer express itself in commerce. The villas were built for Venetian nobles who had shifted their money from trade into land. A sensible move. Also a retreat. The Great Council still met. The Doge still processed through St. Mark's Square in his golden robes. The committees still deliberated. The bureaucracy that had run the most efficient state in medieval Europe still filed its reports and issued its decrees. But the machine was running in a room that was slowly emptying. The decisions being made mattered less and less, because the world was making its own decisions elsewhere, And then came 1796, and a name that Venice had not prepared for. Napoleon Bonaparte was 26 years old when he took command of the French army of Italy in March of that year. He was thin, almost gaunt, with the kind of focused intensity that makes people in the same room feel slightly nervous without knowing why. His army was hungry, underpaid, and positioned along the Ligurian coast in a condition that one French general described as barely functional. None of that mattered. Within a month, he had knocked Piedmont Sardinia out of the war entirely. Within 2 months, he was in Milan. Within a year, he had shattered 4 separate Austrian armies and was advancing through the Alps toward Vienna itself. Venice watched all of this from behind its lagoon and did what Venice had always done when threatened. It declared neutrality. It sent diplomats. It wrote careful letters. It had survived by being clever for 1,000 years. Cleverness, it calculated, would work again. It would not. Napoleon's armies moved through Venetian territory without asking permission. Austrian troops had already violated Venetian neutrality first, marching across the terra firma as if the Republic's borders were lines drawn in water. Napoleon followed. By the spring of 1797, French and Austrian forces had been fighting on Venetian soil for months, and Venice had done nothing except protest politely and hope the storm would pass overhead. It did not pass overhead. It came through the door. In April of 1797, with Austria nearly broken and peace negotiations beginning at Leoben, Napoleon needed something to offer the Austrians as a prize. Something that would make them sign. Something they wanted. He looked at his maps. He looked at the Lagoon city that had declared neutrality while his supply lines ran through its territory, that had tolerated anti-French uprisings in its mainland towns, that had failed to control its own territory. He made a calculation. Venice would be the price of Austrian cooperation. The Great Council met on May 12, 1797. Outside the windows of the Doge's palace, the city was quiet in the way that cities are quiet when everyone is frightened. The last war fleet was anchored in the harbor, the ships riding low, their hulls soft with neglect. The treasury had been depleted by decades of warfare against the Ottomans, by the costs of maintaining an empire that was contracting faster than the budget could follow. The council chamber was full of masterpieces. Tintoretto's enormous canvases covered the walls. The ceiling was gilded. Everything in the room was a monument to what Venice had been. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, reportedly removed his ducal cap during the session and handed it to an attendant. He said he would not be needing it again. The council voted to accept Napoleon's terms, to dissolve, to surrender sovereignty that had been held in one form or another since the first refugees had driven wooden stakes into the mud of the lagoon more than 1,000 years before. No battle, no siege, no last stand on the walls. The thing that ended Venice was not a cannon. It was a clause in a treaty. The Treaty of Campo Formio was signed in October of 1797. Napoleon signed it himself. Under its terms, Venice, including Istria and Dalmatia, was handed to Austria, the most serene republic, the Serenissima, the city that had outlasted Charlemagne and the Crusades and the Black Death and Genoa and the Ottoman Empire, was traded like a parcel of land between two powers who had been fighting over northern Italy for the better part of 2 years. The last ships of the Venetian war fleet were rotting at anchor. The treasury was nearly empty. The Great Council had met in a hall full of masterpieces and argued about nothing, and on the mainland, 30 miles away, a 27-year-old Corsican general, who who had just shattered every army sent against him, had looked at his maps. He had a question for Venice, and Venice had no answer. On the morning of May the 12th, 1797, the men filing into the great council chamber of the Doge's palace were already afraid. You could hear it in the way their footsteps fell. Not the measured tread of senators arriving for business. Something quicker, something that wanted to be somewhere else. Only 537 of the 1,200 patricians who held seats had come. The others had stayed home. Some had already fled the city. The ones who remained settled into their places beneath Tintoretto's vast canvases, beneath the gilded ceiling, beneath all that accumulated magnificence, and they waited for the last Doge of Venice to speak. Ludovico Manin stood before them with what could only be described as a ruined composure. He told them they were surrounded by 60,000 French soldiers. He told them that iron and fire waited any refusal. He asked them to place their trust in God, in His most holy Mother, and in the mercy that might yet follow so many scourges. Then he sat down, and the room went quiet except for the sound of men breathing in a space that had held the business of a republic for more than 1,000 years. Outside in the Piazza San Marco, the Schiavoni, the loyal Dalmatian soldiers who had guarded Venice for generations, were preparing to leave. They raised their muskets and fired a salute to the banner of St. Mark before boarding their transport. The shots echoed through the stone. Inside the chamber, the terrified patricians heard those shots and thought the revolution had already begun. The vote was taken immediately, 512 in favor, 20 against, 5 abstentions. The most serene Republic of Venice was declared abolished. The smell in the room afterward was sweat and candle smoke, and something older, something that had no name. The men dispersed in haste, their robes rustling against the marble floors. Manin walked to the balcony. He looked out at the crowd gathered in the square below. He announced the decision, and the crowd, which the patricians had feared would rise in revolution, did something no one had planned for. They cried out for San Marco. They raised the flag of St. Mark on the 3 masts in the square. They tried to reinstate the Doge. They attacked the houses of the Venetian Jacobins who had helped bring this moment about. The people of Venice, in the last hour of their republic, wanted it to survive. That fact sits in the historical record like a splinter. The men who ended the Republic of Venice were not its enemies. They were its own ruling class, paralyzed by fear of a French general who had told them at Graz on April the 25th that he would be an Attila to the state of Venice. They chose survival. And in choosing survival, they ended the only thing that had made their survival worth choosing. Manin walked back inside. He removed the corno ducale, the stiff horn-shaped cap of gilded brocade that had crowned the head of every doge since the office had existed. He handed it to a servant. He said he would not be needing it again. Then he went home. Not to the Doge's palace. Home, the private residence of the Manin family. On May the 15th, he departed the ducal palace for the last time. The keys to 1,000 years of governance left with him in a coat pocket. Or perhaps they did not. Perhaps they stayed behind on a table somewhere, unclaimed, while the building filled with French soldiers and Jacobin officials who had never built a single thing. The city would remember. What followed was ugly in the way that all endings are ugly when the victors have no restraint. The French looted Venice with a thoroughness that suggested they had been planning it for some time. Of the 184 ships in the arsenal, those already equipped were sent to Toulon. The rest were scuttled. The fleet that had once ruled the Adriatic, that had carried crusaders and merchants and ambassadors across half the known world, was sunk in its own harbour. The arsenal itself, the industrial heart of the Republic, the place where Venice had built the ships that made it an empire, was burned. The bronze horses of San Marco, the four ancient figures that had stood above the basilica since Venice brought them from Constantinople in 1204, were crated and carried to Paris. Napoleon wanted them for his triumphal arch. He got them. The treasury of San Marco was confiscated. The state mint was seized. The Bucintoro, the ceremonial galley from which the Doge had every year cast a ring into the Adriatic to marry Venice to the sea, was stripped of its golden sculptures. Those sculptures were burned on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore to recover their gold leaf, not melted carefully, burned. The man who had signed all of this into existence was 27 years old. He signed the Treaty of Campo Formio on October the 17th, 1797, in a village west of Udine, in a house owned by a local merchant named Bertrando del Torre. The French representative was Napoleon Bonaparte. The Austrian representative was Count Philipp von Cobenzlau. Venice was not represented. Venice was the thing being divided. Under the treaty's terms, the city itself, along with the terra firma, Istria and Dalmatia, went to Austria. The Ionian Islands went to France. The republic that had outlasted Charlemagne, the Crusades, the Black Death, Genoa, and the Ottoman Empire was parceled out between two powers who had spent the previous 2 years trying to destroy each other. On January the 18th, 1798, Austrian troops entered Venice. 3 days later, they held an official reception at the Doge's palace. Ludovico Manin attended as a guest of honor. He sat in the room where he had once presided over the last republic in Europe that had never been a monarchy. He accepted the hospitality of the empire that now owned his city. What passed through his mind is not recorded, but he had said everything that needed saying on May the 12th when he handed away the hat. The Austrian control did not last. By 1805, Napoleon had Venice again. By 1815, Austria had it back. In 1815, Austria had it back. In 1866, Venice became part of the Kingdom of Italy. The city passed through hands like an inheritance nobody quite knew what to do with. But here is what none of those transfers could accomplish. None of them could take back what Venice had already done. Consider what this city built, starting from nothing, starting from refugees driving wooden stakes into a lagoon because the mainland had become too dangerous to survive. They had no agricultural land, no natural resources, no strategic position that any conventional military mind would have chosen. What they had was water, and the genius that water forces on people when drowning is the alternative. From that beginning, Venice invented the modern bank, the system of deposits and transfers that allows money to move across distances without the money itself moving. That was Venetian, the practice of marine insurance, the idea that risk could be pooled and shared across a community of merchants. That was Venetian, double-entry bookkeeping, the foundation of every financial system that followed, spread through Europe from Venice. The word bank itself comes from the bench, the banca, where Venetian money changers sat in the Rialto. Venice gave the world public health administration. When the plague arrived in 1347, Venice was among the first cities to respond with systematic quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Venetian quarantina, 40 days, Venice built the first lazaretto, the first official quarantine island, in 1423. Every hospital protocol, every public health board, every government response to epidemic disease traces a line back to those Lagoon administrators who decided that survival required organization. Venice gave the world a model of republican governance that survived with adaptations for over 1,000 years, not a democracy in the modern sense. An oligarchy, yes, constrained and checked and balanced in ways that prevented any single family from seizing permanent control. The elaborate electoral machinery for choosing a Doge, 30 members chosen by lot reduced to 9, the 9 choosing 40, the 40 reduced by lot to 12, on and on through layers of deliberate complexity, was designed with a single purpose: to prevent tyranny. It worked for longer than any comparable system in history. Venice gave the world music, the Baroque tradition that flows through Bach and Handel, and everything that came after passed through Venice. Through the orphanages where Vivaldi taught, through the churches where polyphony developed into something the rest of Europe had never heard. Venice gave the world glass, Murano glass, the technique of making mirrors that transformed how Europeans saw themselves, literally and figuratively. Venice gave the world printing. Aldus Manutius, publishing the first pocketbooks from his press in the city in the 1490s, making books portable, making reading personal, making the Renaissance mobile. And Venice gave the world its own image, the light that falls on the lagoon at certain hours, the way stone and water and sky combine in the Piazza San Marco, that specific quality of golden late afternoon reflection that painters have been trying to capture for 600 years. Turner came to Venice. Canaletto painted it obsessively. Every photographer who's ever stood on the Rialto Bridge has been trying to catch something that the city has been producing effortlessly for centuries. None of that was in the Treaty of Campo Formio. None of it could be. What Napoleon took was the administration. What he took was the title, the hat, the ceremonial galley, the horses. What he could not take, what no treaty has ever been able to touch, is the fact that Venice proved something. It proved that human ingenuity, applied with sufficient stubbornness over sufficient time, can overcome geography, can overcome plague, can overcome empires, can overcome the basic physical logic that says you cannot build a city on water. The refugees who drove those first stakes into the mud of the lagoon had no reason to believe they would survive the winter. They survived 1,000 years. The bronze horses above San Marco were taken to Paris in 1797. Napoleon displayed them on the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel. After his defeat in 1815, the Congress of Vienna ordered them returned. They came back. They are above the basilica today, or rather, replicas stand in their original positions, while the originals are preserved inside against the salt air. But the point is that they came back, stolen from Constantinople by Venice in 1204, stolen from Venice by Napoleon in 1797, returned in 1815. The horses have outlasted every hand that claimed to own them. That is the story of Venice in miniature. Taken, returned, still standing. The Doge handed away his crown, but you cannot hand away what Venice actually was, because what Venice actually was is still here, still standing on its impossible foundation, still, against all logic, refusing to sink. The lagoon at dawn is the same water it has always been, grey and silver and absolutely still. The way it was when the first boats came across it carrying people who had nothing left but the will to survive. The campanile of San Marco rises above the mist. The stones of the Rialto hold the weight they have held for centuries. Somewhere beneath the surface, wooden piles driven into the mud by hands that have been dust for 1,000 years are still holding the city up. Venice began with nothing. No land, no army, no reason to exist. It built itself out of water and willpower and a genius for survival that no map could predict and no empire could permanently extinguish. The Doge handed away his crown. But you cannot hand away what Venice actually was, because what Venice actually was is still here, still standing on its impossible foundation, still, against all logic, refusing to sink.